First of all, I'm from New York. I'm a New Yorker. I'm an architect, of course, but I've lived in New York pretty much all my life. I've traveled other places. New York is a very diverse city. New York isn't just one place. And too often, New York is perceived as, because of cinema, because of literature, because of press and magazines, as Manhattan, with its density and its scale, its high-rise, but sometimes that density is also at a lower physical height. Even in Manhattan, there's quite a variety of building height, but if you look at New York City as a whole, including the 4 other boroughs outside of Manhattan, the scale and nature of the residential structures are incredibly varied. And what does that mean in terms of housing typology? New York City is not a very old city. There are very few buildings that predate the American Civil War of the middle of the 1800s. There are some. Our City Hall was built in 1812, but you could count, the buildings that are timber construction that weren't replaced by something bigger or more solid on very few fingers. What does that mean? Old buildings in New York, old housing in New York tends to be from the later part of the 1800s. You could find old law tenements, new law tenements from the period toward the end of the 1800s. There was an incredible building boom in New York City, including lots of housing for an expanding population. Why was the population of New York expanding in the late 1840s? Turmoil in Europe, political upheavals in France and Germany. Immigration had been a constant factor with the first European settlements, if you will, back to 1625. Dutch using this as a mercantile port, but the wave of immigration that we're all familiar with, at least as New Yorkers in the 1880s, 1890s, was prefigured in the 1840s by New York being, in the United States in general, being a refuge for people who were fleeing either political oppression or seeking opportunity. New York as a port, many people didn't go any further than where they entered. Why did people stay in New York? There was housing, there were jobs, and there were people who spoke the same language, whether that language was Yiddish or German or French or later waves of immigration, let's say Korean or Chinese or Japanese, Spanish and other languages. Obviously, New York is a melting pot. It's been described as that. But the reason that New York was attractive as a place for people to stay, look at the word stay, they had a place to stay, even if it was just the extra room in the apartment that belonged to someone from the same village, someone from the same city. Made for a variety of housing types that were also the subject of keen scrutiny because the density was looked at also in terms of public health from the earliest days of tenements, where the idea that housing would create a safe place, if not a healthy place, a healthier place than what was the antecedent type of housing, meant that housing reformers, political reformers from the middle, or at least the later part of the 1800s on, were looking at things like light and air. And ultimately, with the creation of the first public housing projects in New York, first houses before World War II, in between the 2 world wars. I should know the exact dates, but if first houses came about by eliminating, rather than building, houses to allow for more light, side black windows. The first built public housing projects in the 30s and then later in the 50s at a higher scale were taking the Corbusian, if you want to attribute it to him, model of ideas to a new level of saying that people could be housed in something where light and air were given, where open space was not an amenity but a factor of how people were housed, and some of the things that seemed revolutionary in terms of their healthfulness and the provision of places for an immigrant population to live in the 1880s were seen as obsolete by the 1930s and the 1950s. And what characterizes these waves of building, usually a coincidence of need. There's always been a housing shortage in New York, despite how attractive it is as a place for people to stay, and usually the ability to react fiscally, financially, politically, socially, to that need by a mechanism that allowed housing to be built.